Vignette 4, Boyce and Rossie, circa 2048. I have 4 grandsons. One of them's now 6. Last week, he asked me why women aren't smarter in movies. We were watching Indiana Jones, which was his choice of a movie. But he made me think about possible conversations between young Indigenous men 30 years from now.
So this next conversation in the year 2048 takes place in the large entrance foyer of the rebuilt Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. The fog swirls by the large windows and rain is streaking down the glass. The weather is big today, as is necessary to occasionally put humans in their place. Just outside, hanging on a branch, swaying in the wind, is Raven. She's muttering to herself as she smooths down her glossy blue back feathers that keep getting disarranged by the wind. There is a prominent sign over the doors. Indigenous Feminisms are medicine for Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous law. Below the sign, a witty student has pinned a colorful poster with, "And it doesn't need a spoonful of sugar."
Below the sign, 2 brothers are seated, both of whom work with Indigenous law and Canadian law. Boyce is a law professor in the JID-JD, aka the Indigenous Law Degree Program. Rossie, QC, is a prominent lawyer specializing in Indigenous land and property law. They are meeting to prepare a retrospective paper for the 30-year anniversary of the JID. And they've decided to focus on the importance of Indigenous feminism to Indigenous law and to their respective careers.
Boyce leans back in the comfy chair. OMG, where do we start on this? What were we thinking when we agreed to do this?
I don't know, but I think that today the spirit of our law professor Kokum is in the form of that raven over there. She is really watching us. Rossie waves at the raven through the window.
Boyce nods, but wants to get started. Come on, bro. I have to pick up the kids from school later, and I've got so much to do today. The baby did not sleep well last night. He yawned.
I hear you, boys. The twins had a pajama party last night. Okay, I sketched out some governing principles from my practice. Our Indigenous law group has been working with communities to articulate and develop citizenship legislation and inclusive legal processes.
Boyce has his computer out. So what does it mean to have Indigenous feminisms as the starting place and foundation of Indigenous law? You know, it's hard to imagine how it was in Kokum's day. No wonder she was so pissed off. Well, sometimes anyways. He glances worriedly at the raven with a silent apology. Remember Kokum's maxim? People live in the worlds they believe to exist, so the work is to expand the legal imagination. If people don't see or understand Indigenous feminisms, they have a narrower lens through which to see the law. Rossie also gets his computer out. Okay, today Indigenous feminisms are the norm for Indigenous law. That's different from how it used to be? Boyce is already typing.
Wait, what are you writing down? Rossie hates getting left behind by his big brother.
Boyce asks, what is different today from 30 years ago? Well, see, first, most Indigenous nationalisms no longer include idealized stereotypes of Indigenous women as being important only because they are idealized mothers or because they form the cultural or spiritual heart of the people. Remember how those essentializations just gave permission to be violent to women who failed or refused to live up to the stereotypes?
Rossie joins in. For white people, these sexist nationalisms were imagined and expressed in The Handmaid's Tale by literary trickster Atwood. But for Indigenous people, this form of impoverished Indigenous nationalist rhetoric was supposed to define us. Hard to imagine people buying into that kind of rhetoric now. Rossie continues. Another change is that the stand-in for Indigenous people is no longer the Indigenous male. Now we start with both the reasonable Indigenous woman and the reasonable Indigenous man. And of course, we also have the Indigenous reasonable trans person.
Boyce's morning coffee finally kicks in and he starts to wake up. Besides, the raven's presence means he should be more creative. Indigenous reasoning is explicitly understood as including the whole person and as being contextualized and informed by emotion and ethics. And remember John Burroughs wrote about Indigenous legal ethics? What else? What else? He's snapping his fingers.
Rossie catches his brother's energy. Okay, the starting place for Indigenous citizenship conversations is Indigenous personhood. In one of her papers, Kokum asked, in Giksan society, what is the Giksan legal imaginary of personhood? According to Giksan law, historic and present, only a Giksan person or legal personality has rights, protections, privileges, responsibilities, and legal liabilities. So historically, how might women and girls have understood themselves as legal persons in Giksan society in accordance with Giksan law?
Boyce continues, and when we teach Indigenous or state law, we ensure that students see all law as gendered and relational. One way I do this is by switching genders when analyzing oral histories and cases. This always raises a lot of questions and debate, but not like before. Remember Kokum was called blasphemous when she did that?
Rossie turns to the raven. Kokum, are we getting anywhere? Yes, there are still outstanding issues. I know we haven't recovered from the Indigenous dark ages of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But then I don't know if a people can ever really recover from that.
The raven shakes her head. Then she has to smooth her feathers again. If you listen closely, you might hear her grumbling.
Rossie turns back to Boyce. I know that there are still too few Indigenous women and trans folk who are partners in law firms in Canada and elsewhere. How are the numbers for Indigenous women and trans folk for full professorships?
Boyce is shaking his head. Sadly, they are still way too low. I think many Indigenous women are still bearing most of the heavy loads of family and communities. There is still so much work to do at the family and community levels. Here is one of the older methodological tools we used to use to introduce the importance of gender. We could still use it to help frame our retrospective. I'm not stopping because we can just cut and go, we'll insert it.
Okay, so do you want to walk through it then? Or what do you want to do?
I'm gonna. Here is one of the older methodological tools we used to use to introduce the importance of gender. We can still use it to help frame our retrospective. Here we have gender shifts then and now. Then people used to ask about the traditional gender roles in a legal order as if they were static and authentic, and as if they had to be preserved as is. Today, we ask how gendered power dynamics shape legal interpretations. We can still talk about gender roles, but the focus on power dynamics shifts from set static roles to how people act, what they do, and how they treat one another. There used to be so many declarations like women must wear skirts at ceremonies. These declarations paralyzed many conversations and left no room for historic or contemporary non-binary genders or sexualities, and they end up being anti-intellectual. Now, we can have conversations about why skirts are so important to some people, and to ask why some other people are so uncomfortable with being asked to wear a skirt. In other words, how are skirts being interpreted? By whom? And for what ends? After all, law does not interpret itself. People used to ask, what are the cultural values concerning gender? It's really hard to disagree about values. They're so hardwired into our hearts and our identities. So now we ask, what are the legal principles concerning gender? So now we focus on how these legal principles are being interpreted, applied, and experienced in practice. Some research used to ask, what are the culturally appropriate ways for women and men to engage in law? Again, this suggests set and static roles that are determined by gender. So in our classes now, we ask, what assumptions are being made about gender and how gendered subjects engage with law and why? Our legal analysis must include who is included, who is excluded, how these inclusions or exclusions are deemed legitimate, and by whom. In the past, we saw the limitations of simply asking, what are the laws about gender? Now, the overall shift is that Indigenous legal research must include questions about how Indigenous laws are gendered. How are they experienced according to one's gender? The shift is from a focus on learning set rules to a more dynamic analysis on legal processes, reasoning, and interpretation in a way that is attentive to power. Also, we have shifted from looking for laws about gender to understanding that all law is gendered. There used to be a retrospective focus on Indigenous peoples rebuilding their legal orders as they were in the past. This was promoted as a way to promote gender balance. But now we've learned to explore deliberative approaches to Indigenous law, which includes discussion, debate, dissent, and change. Our goal became promoting anti-oppressive legal relations for everyone. 30 years on, we have shifted to a more dynamic, practical approach that treats Indigenous laws as something that have and will change, but still have to be distinct to every society.
Rossie has turned back to the Raven. These shifts move past the discussions that got stuck in rigid fundamentalist approaches to gender and law, and which resisted questions about power. We needed more practical and productive legal deliberation. We also needed to keep space open to support the people holding different or opposing opinions. The Raven responds by flying away, but she's smiling. Look closely. Rossie laughs. Boyce, she's gone. I think that means we're done here.
Boyce is busy looking at his phone. Hey, I have to go to the school. My youngest one's not feeling well.
Rossie gathers his things and puts his computer in his bag. See you later, bro. So a conclusion. Let's return to the topic of our earlier conversation between Maria and Charlie. Do you have to know Indigenous law or Wet'suwet'en law to understand what's going on in that conflict? No. You can start with the assumption that Wet'suwet'en law exists with other Indigenous legal orders right across this country and everywhere else. You can start with another assumption that Wet'suwet'en and other legal orders have been disrupted by colonialism and are being rebuilt. Every Indigenous society has legal institutions and processes through which that law operates. And while the law of each society is distinct to it, the law always had to fulfill the functions of law to enable people to collaboratively manage themselves and to manage their conflicts through time. This means that at a bare minimum, there had to be authoritative decision makers, legitimate legal responses, obligations, substantive and procedural rights, and there had to be an accessible public memory, a memory commons that people could draw precedent from. This is what the Wet'suwet'en had. And what's been imposed on top of that is a federal system of governance with the band council system, and there are other state structures that are getting in the way, that they haven't been reconciled with what people already had. So it's not much wonder that there's conflict. So Indigenous law can be taught in many ways. My favorite approach is the pedagogy of discomfort, which means unpacking our own assumptions and seeing how our own work challenges or maintains the relations of power and the oppression that's around people. Here are 2 questions to take into any future conversations. 1, was there a conversation that made you uncomfortable? Why do you think that is? And 2, what would make you more uncomfortable and why? Wait, I hear ravens in the distance. It sounds like they're arguing, and they're laughing too. And that's it.